Welcome back once again to The Close Read. It's always a pleasure to be with you. This is the official podcast of the Claremont Review of Books. Each time we release a new issue, we select a few pieces from that issue and discuss in more depth with the author. We're working now through our spring 2021 issue, the cover theme of which is big tech, but it's a fairly wide-ranging issue with a number of topics addressed. There's transgenderism, there's progressivism in California, and there's Winston Churchill, which is the topic of the interview today. My guest is the estimable Andrew Roberts, author of a number of books, including Churchill Walking with Destiny, widely regarded as the best single-volume biography, perhaps the best biography full stop of Churchill. He's also written most recently Leadership in War, Essential Lessons from Those Who Made History. And he's got another book coming out very shortly, The Last King of America, The Misunderstood Reign of George III. CRB readers will certainly be fascinated to hear a reappraisal of George III. And you can pre-order that now on Amazon. I hope we're going to get into talking about it a little bit here. But first, I just want to introduce Andrew's piece in this issue. It's called Winston is Back! And it's a review of no fewer than 8 books. I won't list the titles of all of them, although you can find them at the heading of the review. And in addition to sort of ranging quite widely over the latest publications in Churchill scholarship, Andrew gives us an assessment in the opening of Churchill's reputation and how it's faring in the current era of woke revolution. I'm going to read just the first paragraph here, and then we'll get into it. Andrew writes, the campaign to cancel Winston Churchill has accelerated swiftly since the Black Lives Matter eruption in the summer of 2020. Churchill College in Cambridge, of all places, organized a panel discussion in which he was accused of genocide, and the British Empire was compared unfavorably to the Third Reich, with no one on the hyper-woke panel dissenting. The National Trust included Churchill's home, Chartwell Manor in Kent, on a list of its properties connected to colonialism and slavery, despite Churchill having shed blood in a campaign to abolish slavery in the Sudan. Statues of him have been vandalized, yet the publishing industry doesn't seem to have been affected, as these 8 books demonstrate. Andrew Roberts, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. That last sentence is strikes a remarkably hopeful note, wouldn't you say? I'd love to hear your reflection on why it is that the publishing industry is not following Churchill College, Cambridge, or a number of other institutions that are trying to cancel Churchill, and whether you think that will last.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Spencer, for inviting me on the show. I wonder if I could just preface my remarks by saying what a great magazine the Claremont Review of Books is. I mean, there is so little out there that does what it does to really to cover the waterfront intellectually in such a rigorous way is a complete delight. I love it when I get it, and it's always the first thing I do is whatever I'm doing, I just stop and sit down and read it. So congratulations on a really fine publication.
Well, thank you. We're very grateful.
With regards to your question, I think you summed it up pretty well when you said the woke revolution. You know, the Churchill studies are undergoing a big revamp as a result of the woke revolution. Overall, I think for the worse. Of those 8 titles, actually 2 of them were painfully woke. The other 6 weren't. And this is the point I was, I suppose, trying to make about the publishing industry, which is that it very much does reflect the outside world. And the outside world very much still loves Winston Churchill. Ordinary people do, people with common sense do, people who aren't trying to make some kind of a extreme left-wing point of view or political opinion. It's people who recognize the extraordinary achievements of the man, still buy books about him, and they don't want to buy books that are sneering and relentlessly negative and subjective. They want to buy objective books, which appreciate that, yes, he made loads of mistakes in his career, but overall he was a very great man.
You mentioned at one point, I think it's the Ian Buruma book, which has this long title, The Curse of Being Special, from Winston and FDR to Trump and Brexit. You mentioned at one point that he may have just thrown the name Churchill into the title because it sells books, precisely because those incorrigible people like to read about Churchill.
Yeah, people do that. They stick Churchill in the title, even if it's only really, as in the Buruma book, a sort of series of rants, really, from the point of view of a left-wing don in a East Coast liberal arts college who clearly hates Brexit and wants to attack Brexit, and thinks that more people are going to buy the book if you get Churchill in the title. It's rather sort of shoehorned in, frankly. That you get that a lot from people. You can just hear the publishers say, "Is there any way we can get Churchill in the title?" I'm afraid the same thing also happens, with other famous people. It's a well-known publishing phenomenon, and I must say that having written 5 books with Churchill in the title myself, I might be considered a bit hypocritical if I go on too long on this line, anyhow.
Well, I wanted to ask you about the experience of addressing Churchill over the course of an entire career. You mentioned in passing that indeed there were mistakes in his life, as there could hardly not be. It's not as if there are no criticisms to be made of him, despite his still being a great man. Can you talk a little bit about how you approach the more complicated parts of his legacy without giving way to this just sort of, tearing down of statues kind of mentality?
Well, it's the part of the best thing about being a historian, really, is that you can be immensely judgmental long after the fact. Boris Johnson calls the Labour leader of the opposition Captain Hindsight. Keir Starmer is called Captain Hindsight, which is an absolutely brilliant put down, because that's exactly, especially over COVID, what he's been doing. But in a sense, all historians are, Colonel Hindsights, and it's part of the fun of it, really. But what one has to try to do as much as possible is to put yourself in the position of somebody who can't see into the future, who recognizes that politics, a lot of politics, is not the politics of the ideal, but the politics of choice. And people are worried about taking routes which have the sort of second best outcome, the second worst outcome, and not necessarily the best. So you have this constant sense, I think, of trying to put yourself into the shoes of the decision maker. Winston Churchill was making decisions he was an MP for nearly 2/3 of the century. He was therefore making decisions the whole time for the first 2/3 of the 20th century, and they weren't always the best ones. He made blunders, one after the other. Really, he got the gold standard wrong, the abdication crisis, the women's suffrage. You name it. Black and tans in Ireland. There are any number of them. The key thing is always to remember that the thing that he got right. The threat from the Germans in the First World War and the Second World War, and the threat from Soviet communism after the Second World War, was so big and so major, and very often he was the only person to be saying the things that he did, that actually they expunge, really, the things that he got wrong.
Yeah, when you address a statesman from this sort of prudentialist standpoint and understand, as you say, that these are decisions being made in real time, nobody knows what's going to happen, and people make mistakes. There's also, of course, the question sort of what's the governing philosophy here? And I wonder if you can speak a little bit to why it was, from a philosophical standpoint, or from at least from a political standpoint, Churchill saw what others would not, or at least would say what others would not. Was there something in his attitude that made him different in that way?
Well, he had the self-confidence, of course, to say things that other people didn't, because partly, at least, because of his background. He was the grandson of a duke. He was at the absolute apex of the Victorian social system. He frankly didn't care what people thought about it, which is an immensely entitled position. Of course, that's something that he would be attacked for, his sense of entitlement nowadays. But actually, it was immensely useful, especially in the 1930s, when he was one of the only people to be denouncing Adolf Hitler and pointing out what a danger and a threat the Nazis were. And although he came under immense attack and was ridiculed in the press and nearly deselected from his seat in the Conservative Party and shouted down in the House of Commons, he didn't alter his message about Hitler and the Nazis one iota, because he had this tremendous self-confidence, which in part, as I say, came from his social background. But he also, as well as that, had a moral courage which was equal to his physical courage, and you see that again and again in his life, which makes him unusual, really, for a statesman and a politician.
Yes, and a joy in that. I mean, something that sticks out to me in his memoir of his early life is the kind of sporting nature with which he takes war. So in that case, physical danger. But he seems to have, in some sense, enjoyed the just sort of back and forth, the charging into battle alone, if needs must. You end the piece, in fact, with a really sort of apt quote from his St. George's Day speech in 1933. He says, "The worst difficulties from which we suffer do not come from without, they come from within. They come from a peculiar type of brainy people always found in our country, who, if they add something to its culture, take much from its strength. But what have they to offer but a vague internationalism, a squalid materialism, and the promise of impossible utopias?" I hear sort of echoes of Burke on the revolution in France there, and it does seem to be a constant, as Churchill says, that it's quite fashionable to invent apologetics for really what turn out to be the worst tyrants in history, as the 20th century shows. Do you have any sense of why that should be so appealing to a certain class of intelligentsia?
Well, you certainly say it today, don't you? I mean, that quote could be said about people who apologize for the Putin regime, for the Venezuelan regime, certainly for the Chinese government. I mean, these are the Iranians. You get, especially in my country, people who stick up for them as well.
Sure.
And they're highly intelligent people, Oxford and Cambridge educated, and authors and writers and intellectuals and so on. And they will come out with defense for the most appalling regimes which treat human rights with contempt and so on. So it isn't just he wrote that on St. George's Day, 1933, so 3 months after Adolf Hitler came to power. But frankly, it could have been written at any stage in the 20th century. And even earlier, of course, from that period, for all the people who apologized for the Soviet regime as well, the Bolshevik regime, since 1917. And it's a form of psychological disorder, isn't it? It's a way of so hating your own democratic government that you want to embrace pretty much anything that will oppose it. And it's a form of self-hatred that is ever present in the human condition, it seems. But that doesn't mean, by the way, that we shouldn't expose it and constantly hold it up to ridicule and contempt.
Right. I mean, that was something he was, I think, almost uniquely good at in his time. And I come back now to this sort of sense of joie de vivre, something I've always wondered about Churchill, and you seem like a good person to ask. I mean, the tremendous verve with which he tackled these, what must have been absolutely terrifying, critical moments in history and in his personal life. It's hard not to sense in that a certain kind of bravado, and to wonder, how much of it was for show, how much internal self-doubt there was. In your own research, do you find any indication that there was, conflict that we didn't see at the time that was behind the scenes?
Oh, yes. No, absolutely. I mean, I wouldn't call it bravado, particularly when one looks at his resignation from the government in 1915 and going off to fight in the trenches. January 1916, going off to fight in the trenches. That's actual bravery rather than bravado. But at the same time, he certainly was extraordinarily good at self-examination. In fact, some of the most powerful critiques of him are the ones written by himself in his various writings, many of which are autobiographical, even though they don't necessarily say so on the cover.
Sure.
he was constantly, as he said, holding himself up nightly to a court martial. He would before he went to sleep court martial himself on whether or not he'd done the right thing, or worked hard enough that day. And so yes, self-criticism was a strong part of his makeup. And I think one of the most attractive parts of it as well, because God knows there are enough politicians who go through their careers without ever self-criticizing
Right.
or thinking that they got anything wrong ever at any stage. And so when you bump into one who is, I mean, doesn't draw attention to his mistakes and failings whilst he's making them. Of course not. He is a politician in that sense.
Sure.
But he's a extraordinarily honest one when it comes to self-evaluation.
Right, as you say, it's rare, at least, to meet a politician who lets on that he knows he's made a mistake, and there is something comforting about that, just because Churchill's own accomplishments from really his 20s onward are so intimidating. I'd like to ask you a little bit about his legacy, in part because some of the woke critiques that you describe in this review seem eminently ready to link him to any number of subsequent events in British history, some of which seem only loosely connected to Churchill. I mean, Brexit is an interesting example here. But of course, this was a towering figure, and I'm willing to be persuaded that there's something in the spirit of Brexit that is also the spirit of Churchill. I mean, where do you see his since indeed he still carries a certain weight among regular folks? Where do you see his legacy sort of most active and most manifest in modern Britain?
Well, since you mentioned Brexit, his name was, of course, brought up on both sides of the discussion very much. The Remainers pointed out quite rightly that he was a father of the European movement. He never wanted to see France and Germany go to war with one another. As he said, Teuton must never fight Gaul. And so, he was a progenitor of the European movement, but at no stage did he ever believe that Britain should be part of it, to be a political part of the sort of federalizing movement that he was all in favor of. He thought that France and Germany certainly should, and other countries that made sure that those two countries couldn't fight each other again. But he saw Britain as being allied to and closely involved with and friendly with, and obviously geographically adjacent to this federation. But he also saw Britain having a key role to play in the special relationship with the United States, of course, and with the Commonwealth and the wider family of British countries around the world. So the Anglosphere, as we call it today. So of course he didn't want Britain to be sucked into a union which had legislative powers over Britain. And so, in a sense, the Leavers, the Brexiteers, of which I was one, I think have a far better sort of call on Churchill. But as Churchill's daughter, Mary Soames, told me, you must never assume that you know what Papa would have done in any circumstances after his death. So in a sense, both sides were wrong to be dawing on Churchill over the Brexit debate, because it was half a century after the vote was taken, half a century after his death.
Fascinating. There's one other analog that occurs to me as you're speaking about yourself being a Leaver, and that is the sort of universal snide disdain with which people in power and with influence tended to treat the Leaver side. Associating it with these kind of atavistic prejudices. It strikes me that there's something similar there in the way that Churchill was sort of ready to stand up against received elite opinion.
Oh, very much so, yes. And it does take some doing, really. I think that quite a lot of people's, especially academics, careers have been damaged by their support for Brexit, because some 90%, 85 or 90%, I can't remember the exact number, of academics were Remainers. And
Right.
I feel very sorry for my friends in academia who have drawn the short straw, really. But how brave of them not to have done what I'm afraid quite a lot of people must have done, which is just to say one thing and then in the referendum to vote another.
Right.
We couldn't have won if everybody had genuinely been a Remainer who said so. But there was a lot of sort of secret or quiet Brexiteers who voted one way whilst keeping quiet about it. I don't like that attitude in politics. I think it would be much better if people actually said what they thought and said how they were going to vote. But that's not the way society is moving at the moment at all, unfortunately, especially with this cancel culture that we're getting. If anything, it's sort of speeding up the process where people are scared to speak out about their politics.
Well, I think the importance of that is even greater for people in whatever sort of position of intellectual or public influence. And so to see members of the academy behaving that way, I think is particularly dispiriting, just because there's, what have they to offer if not intellectual courage? But without sort of going too far down the cancel culture rabbit hole, you mentioned the special relationship, and I think that's probably a good segue into talking about this latest book, which I assume you've now just finished, a reappraisal of George III, or maybe it only counts as a reappraisal from the perspective of an American. Of course, this is the big baddie in the kind of potted history of our revolution. But as you're suggesting, it's much more complicated. Could you tell us a little bit about that project and what drew you to it?
Yes, what I'm going to try and persuade Americans is that George III was not the villain that's he's made out to be in the Declaration of Independence, or the tyrant, the sort of vicious tyrant that you see in Hamilton the musical, or the sort of slightly absurd figure that you see in Bridgerton as well.
Oh, right, sure.
But in fact, you have actually an enlightened monarch, somebody who is tiptoeing towards constitutionalism in the British context, certainly, who is a Renaissance man when it comes to culture. And in fact, only today I spent an hour and a half in his library at the British Library, the 80,000 volumes that he built up over his life, right, including ones like a biography of George Washington, published in 1807. Which is not the kind of thing that some evil, obstinate tyrant who hates all Americans would have bought, I can assure you. It's in 5 volumes, beautiful thing.
Wow. Yeah.
So actually, I think we've got to look again. There hasn't been a major cradle to the grave life of George III. There's been one published since 1972. I think in half a century, it's worthwhile having a reappraisal of this figure. He's actually a rather delightful human being. So I'm going to see if I can persuade Americans to take another look at it.
I'm told also that he did other things besides tax American colonists. I mean, does the book address his sort of domestic policies and some of his?
Well, when you say tax American colonists, every penny of that tax was spent on defending American colonists. I think it's very important to remember that he didn't bring the money back to buy his library that I just mentioned. He actually spent it on soldiers defending the western parts of your 13 colonies. So very important to get these kind of facts in straight. He was an art collector. He was founded the Royal Academy of Arts. He was a great supporter of the music of Handel here in England. The agricultural advances, the beautiful buildings that he built. I mean, this is a man who was cultured in every possible way, and for Tom Paine to denounce him in Common Sense as the royal brute really was a totally outrageous and incorrect thing. But it's propaganda. It's wartime propaganda. America was quite right to become a sovereign and independent country in the 1770s. It had every right to do what it did. But equally, you can't expect a ruler in the 1770s not to put up a fight It had never been done before. No country just gets to secede entirely without bloodshed at that time.
You are in some sense answering the big question that I was about to ask you, which is, do you go so far as to say that the revolution itself was a mistake? It sounds, of course, like you don't.
No. In fact, let me go further to say, actually, Americans are a greater people than they think they are, because they got their independence. They fought for their independence incredibly bravely, without having been tyrannized. America was one of the freest countries in the world in the 1770s, and it's almost banal, the number of countries that escape from tyranny. That's easily done. That happens throughout history. There are any number of examples of it. What is really rare is a country that's not being tyrannized, but recognized that it would rule itself better if it were independent, and still be willing to go to war and to risk everything in the demand for independence. I think Americans actually, and America itself, the United States, comes out better in my book after they accept the fact that George III was not a tyrant.
Well, that is an extremely intriguing argument. I look forward to reading it in full. Folks should pre-order it if they haven't already while listening to it. Listening to us. It's The Last King of America by Andrew Roberts. I will reserve final judgment on the monarch until I've read it. But I really appreciate, Andrew, your coming on and talking Churchill and George III. It's been such a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Spencer. I've enjoyed it enormously.
Once more for our listeners, Andrew Roberts' piece, his review of 8 books in the latest CRB, is called Winston is Back. And you can find it if you subscribe. It's probably already in your mailbox, as is the whole issue. But you can also go to ClaremontReviewOfBooks.com and find it online, although you may have to get behind a paywall, which, of course, I encourage you to do if you're listening to this. Thank you all, as always, for listening, and we will see you again next time.